Scenario 15. Human Development. Real Scene 2. The most important events of the last century.
It's one small step for a man, but a giant leap for mankind. My goal. Once I complete Scenario 15, I will be able to correctly use present continuous tense with the phrase going to, and I'll be able to give messages using tell and ask. The reading material will provide me with interesting information about the most important events of the last century.
Introductory questions. Number 1. In your opinion, what are the most important events of the last century? Number 2. How much do you know about World War II? Number 3. What do you hope will be the most important events of this century?
World War I. World War I was primarily a European conflict with many facets. Immense human sacrifice, statement trench warfare, and the use of new, devastating weapons, tanks, aircrafts, machine guns, and poisonous gases. World War I, also known as the First World War, the Great War, the War of the Nations, and the War to End All Wars, was a world conflict which took place between 1914 and 1918. The war was fought by the Allies on one side and the Central Powers on the other. No previous conflict had mobilized so many soldiers or involved so many in the field of battle. By its end, the war had become the second bloodiest conflict in recorded history, behind the Taiping Rebellion, though it was surpassed with a generation by World War II. No other war changed the map of Europe so dramatically. 4 empires were shattered: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian. The 4 Russian dynasties, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Romanovs, who had roots of power dating to the days of the Crusades, all fell during or after the war. World War I became infamous for trench warfare, where troops were confined to trenches because of tight defenses. This was especially true in the Western Front. Over 9 million soldiers died on the battlefield, and nearly that many more due to food shortages, genocide, and ground combat.
Among other notable events that occurred during World War I was the use of chemical weapons for the first time, the first large-scale bombing from the air, and some of the century's first large-scale civilian massacres took place. The causes of World War I were complex developments in themselves. The events leading up to World War I were complex and led, ultimately, to a break with the old world order and the final demise of absolutist monarchy in Europe. The post-war failure to deal effectively with many of the causes and results of the First World War would lead to the rise of fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and the outbreak of World War II within a generation. World War I was the catalyst for the Bolshevik Russian Revolution, which would inspire later communist revolutions in China and Cuba, and would stage the foundations for the Cold War hostilities that existed between the Soviet Union and the United States for decades. The war ended the Ottoman Empire in the East and laid the ground for a modern democratic successor state, Turkey. In Central Europe, the new countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were formed, and Poland was reinstated. Activity by the French and British Empire forces in the eastern part of the former Ottoman Empire would give rise to several modern conflicts: the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Greco-Turkish conflict over Cyprus, the Iran-Iraq conflict and the Gulf War in the 1990s. The Greco-Turkish conflict, which ended in 1924, was the last direct major conflict of the war. In Germany, the losses incurred at the Western Front had severe consequences. The shortage of food and the amount of casualties generated a national revolt, powered by the socialist parties. This revolution was responsible for the abdication of the Kaiser or Emperor. The noblemen realized the situation was critical and decided not to pursue the title themselves, and the Social Democrats took a stronger hold of the government. The parliament had to be temporarily relocated to the city of Weimar because of the chaos that existed in Berlin. However, this new republic, called the Weimar Republic, shattered shortly afterwards. In 1933, Adolf Hitler, head of the National Socialist Party, NAZI, took control of the parliament and appointed himself Führer, leader, of his self-proclaimed Third Reich, or Third German Empire. Meanwhile, Russia was undergoing a revolution of its own. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin, with support from Germany, made his way to Russia and launched a full-scale revolution against the monarchy. It took years for Russia to achieve a degree of peace after the revolutions which followed that first major rebellion against the Tsar. By the time the dust settled, Lenin had died, and his successor, Joseph Stalin, took over. Stalin became known as one of the most ruthless leaders of the modern world. If it hadn't been for Hitler's demented hatred and persecution of the Jews, Stalin's purges and mass murder would have earned him the title of most terrible dictator in history. His famous sentence says it all. If a man dies, it is a tragedy. If millions die, it is just a statistic. World War II. Attributed in varying degrees to the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, and the rise in nationalism, fascism, National Socialism, Japanese imperialism, and militarism, the exact causes of the war are complex and a matter of debate. Similarly, the exact date at which the war commenced differs between historians. While the most common date given is the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, others maintain that the war began when Hitler's armies entered Prague in March 1939. Still other historians feel that the war began when the Japanese invaded China on July 7th, 1939, or even with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. World War II was fought between the Axis countries of Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and the Allies, Britain, Russia, the United States of America, China, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Czechoslovakia, New Zealand, Norway, Ethiopia, Greece, India, Mexico, the Netherlands, the Philippines, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. Fighting occurred across the Atlantic Ocean, in Western and Eastern Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea, Africa, the Middle East, in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and China. In Europe, the war ended with the surrender of Germany on May 8, 1946, on what came to be known as Victory Day, but continued in Asia until Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, on VJ Day. At least 50 million people died as a result of the war. This figure includes acts of genocide, such as the Holocaust and General Ishishiro's Unit 731 experiments in Pinggan, as well as the bloody battles in Europe and the Pacific Ocean. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan alone killed approximately 250,000 within hours. There were few areas of the world that were unaffected. The war was the catalyst that brought about a variety of wartime inventions and new tactics that changed the nature of the battle for all time. Atomic weapons, jet aircrafts, rockets, radar, blitzkrieg or lightning war, torpedo bombers and destroyer tanker formulation are only a few. Post-World War II Europe was divided into Western and Soviet spheres of influence, with the former undergoing economic reconstruction via the Marshall Plan, and the latter becoming a collection of satellite states governed by the Soviet Union. However, this partition was rather informal, and instead of coming to a peaceful acceptance regarding the spheres of influence, the relationship between the victors steadily deteriorated. Eventually, the lines of demarcation became the de facto country boundaries. Western Europe aligned as NATO, and Eastern Europe operated under the Warsaw Pact, alliances which were to become fundamental to the ensuing Cold War. In Asia, the United States military occupation of Japan led to its democratization. China's civil war continued through and after the war, resulting eventually in the establishment of the People's Republic of China. A desire for independence was sparked in the colonies of European powers, which were exhausted from fighting the war. Though there were few actual boundary changes, there was a fundamental shift in power from Western Europe to the new superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union.
Grammar structure 1. Present continuous tense with be going to. The present continuous tense can be used to indicate that something will or will not happen in the future just by adding a future reference. Future continuous tense structure. Subject plus auxiliary verb plus auxiliary verb plus main verb plus complement. I will be going to work. You will be studying English. But it can also refer to the future by just adding a future reference. Example: subject plus auxiliary verb plus main verb plus future reference. I am celebrating tonight. You are traveling next week. Writing. Exercise 1. Fill in the blanks in the questions and answer below using future continuous tense and the correct form of be going to. Match the questions to the answers. A. 1. What you do tonight? Would you like to go out? 2. You do anything on Friday night? Do you want to see a movie? 3. We have friends over for picnic on Saturday. Would you and your parents like to come? 4. You stay in town next weekend? Do you want to go for a ride? B. A. I be here on Friday, but not on Saturday. Let's go on Friday. B. Well, my mother visit my sister at school, but my father and I be home. We'd love to come. C. Sorry, I can't. I work tonight. How about tomorrow? D. Can we go to a late show? I stay at work until 7:30 p.m.
Number 3. Lunar exploration.
History. Permanent human habitation on a planetary body other than the Earth is a central theme in science fiction. As technology has improved and concerns about the future of humanity on Earth have increased, some argue that space colonization is an achievable and worthwhile goal. The Moon has long been seen as a candidate for a possible human colony because of its proximity to the Earth and the early observation of familiar landforms such as mountains and plains. The Apollo space program, although successful in its goal to put a human being on the lunar surface, dampened enthusiasm for such a lunar colony because its rock and dirt samples brought back by astronauts proved extremely low in the lighter elements required as a condition for life. Many advocates of space colonization, such as the Mars Society, have since turned their attention to Mars, which has a more Earth-like environment. Others, such as the National Space Society and the Moon Society, continue to maintain that the Moon is a logical first step. The possibility of clean fusion powers from helium-3 fuel mined on the Moon is cited by some as a potential economic justification for a lunar base. NASA's Vision for Space Exploration plan includes a return trip to the Moon. The idea of constructing a human colony on the Moon originated prior to the space age. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian rocket scientist who lived from 1857 to 1935, was one of the many who suggested such a plan long before human beings ever left the Earth's atmosphere. From the 1950s, a number of concepts and designs have been suggested by scientists, engineers and architects. Science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke proposed a lunar base of inflatable modules, covered in lunar dust for insulation in 1954. He imagined a spaceship travelling to the Moon after being assembled in low Earth orbit. It would land on Mare Imbrium, a vast ancient volcanic plain, and astronauts would set up the igloo-like modules with an inflatable radio mast. Subsequent steps would include the establishment of a larger permanent dome, an algae-based air purifier, a nuclear reactor for the provision of power, and electromagnetic cannons to launch cargo and fuel to interplanetary vessels. In 1959, John S. Reinhardt suggested that the safest design would be a structure that could float in a stationary ocean of dust. At the time this concept was outlined, theories existed that there could be mile-deep dust oceans on the Moon. The proposed design consisted of a half-cylinder with half-domes at both ends. A micrometeoroid shield was to be placed above the base. Project Horizon was created in 1959 and outlined a plan for the US Army to establish a fort on the Moon by 1967. H. Koelle, a German rocket engineer of the Army Ballistic Missiles Agency, ABMA, led the Project Horizon study. The first landing would be completed by 2 soldier astronauts in 1965, and construction workers would soon follow. A series of Saturn rockets would transport 245 tons of cargo to the outpost by 1966.
Grammar structure 2. Messages with tell and ask. We use tell in messages that are making a statement. We use ask in messages that are making a request. Statement. The World Cup takes place in the summer. Message. Please tell him that the World Cup takes place in the summer. Could you tell them that the World Cup takes place in the summer? Would you tell her that the World Cup takes place in the summer? Request. Call me in the morning. Please ask him to call me in the morning. Could you ask her to call me in the morning? Would you ask him to call me in the morning? Writing. Exercise 2. Think of an unusual message for a friend. Write a note to a second friend asking him to pass on the message. Example: Dear John, it's my graduation tomorrow. Could you please tell everybody that I want to have a wild party at the beach? Also, could you ask Mike to bring some wine? Thanks. Tony.
Number 4. Internet.
Motivation for the Internet. The need for a working Internet developed along with a number of innovative networking technologies, in particular the first packet radio networks, a satellite packet communication program, and local area networks, LANs. Connecting these disparate networking technologies was not possible using the methodologies in existence prior to the late 1980s. An entirely new kind of networking architecture was needed. Early Internet work. Engineer and computer scientist Robert E. Kahn, together with a computer scientist named Vincent Cerf from the University of California, began researching packet network interconnection protocols. They soon worked out a fundamental reformulation where the differences between network protocols were hidden using a common inter-network protocol, and instead of the network being responsible for the reliability, as in the ARPANET, the predecessor to the Internet, the hosts became responsible. With the role of the network reduced to the bare minimum, it became possible to join almost any networks together, no matter what their characteristics were. A computer called a gateway or a router is provided with an interface to each network, and it forwards packets back and forth between them. Happily, this new concept was a perfect fit with the newly emerging local area networks. Early growth. After ARPANET had been up and running for a decade, cutting-edge research and development was turned over to the Defense Communications Agency, also part of the Department of Defense. In 1983, TCP IP protocols replaced the earlier NCP protocol as the principal protocol of the ARPANET. In 1984, the US military portion of the ARPANET was separated from the main network and went on to become MILNET. The early Internet, based around the ARPANET, was government-funded and therefore restricted to non-commercial uses such as research. Unrelated commercial use was strictly forbidden. This initially restricted connections to military sites and universities. During the 1980s, the connections expanded to include educational institutions, and a growing number of companies such as Digital Equipment Corporation and Hewlett-Packard, which were participating in research projects or providing services to those who were. The National Science Foundation became involved in Internet research in the mid-1980s. The NSF-Net backbone was designed to connect and provide access to a number of supercomputing centers established by the NSF. At the end of the 1980s, the US Department of Defense decided the network had developed enough for its purposes and decided to discontinue further funding. The ARPANET was gradually shut down, and the NSF, a civilian agency, assumed responsibility for providing connectivity in the US. In another NSF initiative, regional TCP IP-based networks continued to develop and began interconnecting the nascent fledgling Internet. This greatly expanded the research of the rapidly growing network. On April 30, 1995, the NSF privatized access to the network they had created. It was at this point that the growth of the Internet really took off.
Research Spot. Look for more information about 1. Most important events in your country in the last 10 years. 2. 2004 tsunami. 3. Mars exploration.